My name is Samantha Krantz, and I am the Remember Program Associate of the Charleston Jewish Federation's Remember Program, along with my incredible chairs of the Remember Program Committee, Eileen Turbo and Reggie Guigui. On behalf of the Remember Program, we would like to welcome you to the second series of the Children of Holocaust Survivors panel. The Charleston Jewish Federation's Remember Program for Holocaust Education and Genocide Awareness shares the lessons from the Holocaust to build community amongst all races, faiths, and ethnicities in Charleston, and inspire our citizens to take a stand against hate, prejudice, anti-Semitism, and intolerance. Please reach out to me at remember@jewishcharleston.org if you would like to volunteer with the Remember Program or to learn about all the initiatives going on, such as virtual programs in the schools, a busy speakers bureau making presentations all over the community, a teen cohort fostering Holocaust education leaders for the future. Tonight, we gather as a community to learn from 6 children of Holocaust survivors: Reggie Guigui, Sandra Brett, Murray Treiser, Dr. Evaline Delson, Phillis Mair, and Dr. Fred Volkman. We are here tonight to listen to the stories of hope, trauma, and survival, but also to continue fighting hatred and bigotry through education. The panel will be moderated by Eileen Chepenik, who currently serves as the president of the Charleston Jewish Federation. Eileen works by day as the executive director of Trident Literacy, but in her free time, she's involved in numerous initiatives that benefit Holocaust education and awareness, such as serving as on the past executive board of the South Carolina Council of the Holocaust. She's interviewed numerous survivors for Steven Spielberg's Visual History of the Shoah Foundation and directs the Holocaust Supplement each year in the Post and Courier. We are thankful to have Eileen with us today as the moderator and to begin the first question of this panel. If you have any questions during the panel, please use the question function to ask. We will try to get to as many questions as possible tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's get started. The first question, tell us briefly how or where your parents survived and how they ended up in Charleston or in the United States. Sandra, would you start?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having this program, to everyone that made it possible, and to all of you that are listening out there. My name is Sandra Brett, and both my parents are Holocaust survivors. They have very different stories. My mother was born in 1924 in Pabianice, Poland, which was a small town near the Lodz Ghetto. And this is a picture of her parents, which was taken in the 1930s. So she had a really happy childhood. And she, was just a regular teenager. And of course, that all changed September 1st, 1939, when the Germans came into her small town of Pabianice. They turned her town of Pabianice, the Jews had to be, into a ghetto. And there she was able to remain with her parents and her 3 siblings until 1942. So it was awful. They were hungry. They didn't have enough to eat, but they were together. Well, that all changed in 1942 when the Germans decided to disband that ghetto. And they sent people either to Chelmno, which was a death camp, or if people could work, they sent them to the Lodz Ghetto. So that was a very painful memory for my mother, because that's when she was separated from her mother and her 2 younger siblings. They were immediately sent to their death in Chelmno. You might not have heard of Chelmno because nobody has survived. They were immediately gassed. She and her father and another older sibling were sent to the Lodz Ghetto. You spell Lodz, L-O-D-Z. It was a big industrial town where there was a lot of textiles going on, so that the Lodz Ghetto was actually able to survive until 1944 because they made German uniforms and they were able to, have industry for the Germans there. So my mother was in the Lodz Ghetto with her older sister, with her younger sister and father until 1944. They had a lot of connections. So they were able to buy some bread on the black market. My grandfather apparently was very good in doling out the food so that it would last for the whole time. And then that all changed when the Germans finally closed that down in 1944. At that point, they sent everybody to Auschwitz. My mother and her sister were separated from their father. They she didn't know what happened to her father at that point, but her and her sister were just in Auschwitz for not very long, a couple of weeks, and they were sent to an airplane factory in Freiburg, Germany, where they spent the last months of the war. At that time, the Germans knew they were losing, but still they didn't have enough to eat, and you know, the circumstances were dire. When the Allies were close by, they were shipped off to Camp Mauthausen, and that's where my mother and her sister were liberated. Unfortunately, her sister died of typhus or some other communicable disease right after the liberation. My mother did survive, however, found out where her father was. Her father had been in Dachau. They were reunited in a displaced person camp, and they eventually came to join some relatives in the United States and New Jersey. So this was their mother and father. Next slide, please. This is a picture. As I said, she had a rather happy childhood. She is not in this picture, but it's a picture of a class that she might have been in. Next slide. And now I'm going to go on to my father's story. My father was born in a shtetl in Lithuania called Škudvil, which I'm sure you never heard of. And he had several older brothers which had gone to Lithuania or to South Africa from Lithuania before the war, but my father was too young. He was raised by his father, who was a very well-known rabbi, and his sister, who you see here, because because his mother died in childbirth. So he was an ardent Zionist as a child, and his father was a rabbi who was rather liberal, actually, and everything was not good there. In 1941, the Germans finally invaded their town. At that point, my father's father, my grandfather, said, Leon, my father's name was Leon, you better leave because you're a young man. They'll definitely, want to kill you. Nothing's going to happen to me. Everything will be fine. So my father had a bicycle because his brother-in-law there owned a little shop where he sold English bicycles. My father ran away from this town, and just about everybody in that town of Škudvil were killed. Only about 10 people survived. My father went to a larger town nearby called Shabel, where he had relatives. And after some harrowing experiences with the Russians and the Lithuanian peasants, and it goes on and on and on. In any case, in Lithuania, they did not go to concentration camps per se. They had work assignments outside of the ghetto. And eventually at one of these work assignments, a guard helped him escape and join a group of Jewish partisans. This was in 1944. And that's how he survived the rest of the war until he was liberated by the Russians. He had relatives in the United States in Altoona, Pennsylvania, a small town outside of Pittsburgh. So that's where he went. He eventually went to Pittsburgh. He was a watch repairman, found work there, met my mother at a picnic through a mutual friend in New York. They got married. They stayed in Pittsburgh, and they were able to then go to Johnstown, where my father found another job. And they basically just loved their life in Johnstown. They were very happy to be in Johnstown after all the trauma they had survived. And like most survivors, they were just thrilled to be able to have a family.
Thank you so much, Sandra.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's Dad and his members of his partisan group in 1944. And then I think there's one more picture that I don't know why it's wide like that, but that's my mom and dad in Johnstown in 1949. Next slide. And that's my parents speaking to school children in 2005.
Thank you. Next up is Fred.
Hi, I'm Fred Volkman. My parents were Michael and Susan Volkman. Both my parents had very different stories. For my mother, I'll start first. The picture you see on the right with the group picture, there are about 25 or 26 people in that picture. Only 2 survived the war. My mother's in the bottom row. You see a little S there, that's for Susan, her name, and then her uncle, who also survived, is in the top row, second to the left. So both my parents grew up in areas around Krakow on farms, so they were farmers. And for my mom, The Germans had come in pretty early and taken a good amount of the family away, but her and her uncle and a few other people were in some of the smaller ghettos. As Sandra had said, there were a lot of ghettos that we aren't as well known as Warsaw, but that's where a lot of people were, and the conditions were pretty bad. They escaped one of the ghettos, got recaptured, and then was in another ghetto, and then they escaped those, and they were in hiding the rest of the war, usually in different farms. My uncle, who was with her, had some money stashed in different places, and they, either paid people off or worked on the kindness of people throughout the entire war. When the war was over and they were liberated, they ended up in a displaced persons camp. I'll switch over to my dad's story, and he was he was assigned to, when the Germans really didn't come in initially, but the people who were complicit with the Germans, the Ukrainians, had guards that came in and basically took people and made them do work details on the roads and other farms. After a few months, my dad was taken into Gestapo headquarters, where Germans had come in and thought that he was working with partisans, and they were torturing him for information, which he didn't give them. He actually had been working with them. But then at that time, him and his brother, who were the only people left in the area, the rest of his family were taken away. They were sent to a concentration camp called Mielec, which is in Poland. And it was a work camp. They had it was a Messerschmitt factory, so they did a lot of basically slave labor. And then then after a little while, they were taken to a different concentration camp called Flossenburg, which was in Germany. And that was also a work camp. It was also an international camp. Conditions were terrible there as well. And his brother had died of typhus while they were at that camp. Towards the end of the war, the Germans were invading, and the Polish were on one side, the United States was on the other side, and then they went on they put them in trains, and many people were killed in the trains. Many of the prisoners as Holocaust survivors, who didn't survive, because American planes were strafing those trains, thinking that they were German troop trains. So the tracks were blown up. They started doing the death march through the forest. And my father and a few other people just figured they had nothing to lose, and they just ran out from the lines. And the Germans were too tired to run after them, so they just took their machine guns and strafed the areas. My dad was struck twice in the neck, and he woke up in a U.S. Army Red Cross station. For a day, he couldn't talk because he had the bullet wounds in his neck. But they didn't see the tattoo on his arm, and they finally got a Jewish chaplain to come in and talk to him. My dad essentially had nobody at that time, and so they asked him if he wanted to work with the United States Army and with the UN relief efforts, which he said he would do. So they trained him to speak and write English. My dad was a quick study on that. Part of his work was sitting inside German prisoner barracks, because he knew German just from being in the camps, and he wore POW uniforms, and his assignment was to listen to what they had to say so they could find more important German officials, and then they go out in the field, and it sounds like a movie, but they go out in the field and try and find these people. He also worked with some UN relief efforts, and he went to some displaced persons camps where they distributed food. That's where he met my mother. And then the other part he had worked on was sort of clandestine efforts of getting Jews into Israel, because there was limits from the British in Israel, and they worked in getting those people from the various areas and displaced persons camps into Israel. The United States Army said they didn't cooperate, but they looked the other way. So that's one of the things he did. The picture you see on the left there says 1946 in Germany. They actually they gave my dad a uniform, and he's looking kind of a badass there with the little thing out of his mouth and the sunglasses. And he said it was a very interesting couple of years when he's doing that work over there. But after 2 years, they disbanded the unit that he was in, and they basically paid his way to go to the United States. He didn't have anybody sponsoring him to go to the US, but my mom was already in the United States because she was sponsored by some relatives that were there. So she was in Chicago at the time, so he went to Chicago. Before that, he had written a letter to my mom because he was thinking of going to Israel and fight for the War of Independence. And essentially her letter back to him was, "Are you crazy?" So he went to the United States, to Chicago, and they lived on the west side of Chicago for a while, and then they did the Jewish migration, which in Chicago was from the west side to the north side. And that's pretty much what their story was. So they didn't have anybody, neither of them had much at all as far as family goes, except that my mom's uncle, which was my great uncle, and his wife did survive the war. So that was our immediate family. And that's essentially my story of my mom and dad.
Thank you so much, Fred. Next is Phyllis.
Hi, I'm Phillis Mair. My mom is Deensha Atkins, and my grandparents are Philip and Evaline Krant. They lived in Holland. They were married in the early 30s, and mom was born in 1938. So unlike a lot of people, my mom is a child survivor of the Holocaust, which actually is a whole other experience for, of course, my mom, but her whole family. My grandparents were very smart people, and they could tell that Holland was getting pretty active with the German activity. They had taken over the school in Bussum, where my mom is from. She's from Bussum, Holland, and my mom was very rambunctious, and even at a young age of about 4 years old, 5 years old, I think it was actually, she was about 4 when in 1942, oops, I'm sorry. And my grandparents were very concerned about her well-being because of her being so rambunctious. So sorry, my computer is acting up. Sorry about that. So they looked outside one day because she was nowhere to be found in the house. And they looked, and there was a bunch of soldiers that were leaving the school and marching in the street. And there was my mom behind all of these soldiers with a pot on her head, marching behind them. And that's when they knew that even though she was a lovely child, that it was just too dangerous. They decided that they needed to put her in a separate hiding place. And that was very difficult for my mom because of her age. And she had a rough go at it. Her first hiding place in Bussum was a children's home where she had to pretend to be a Christian child. And she didn't really, know how to lie. It's not something that kids do naturally. And she was walking around the school one day and said, "I can't wait until my next birthday. I get to wear my yellow star." And so then that hiding place was the end of that one. So my grandfather found a gentleman who is in this picture that you're seeing, and his name was Meneer, which is Mr. van Hustela, and he was a very bad person. He took money from my grandparents and other family members and then betrayed their trust and then ratted our families out. So my grandparents were hiding in place after place from, they were mostly in Amsterdam and in smaller towns. And then they also made it back to Bussum because that, I think, was their comfort zone. And they had contact with this Meneer van Hustela somehow. I'm not quite certain of the details because my grandparents actually never spoke of the war. That was one of the problems with my mom, was that she wasn't allowed to speak about things after the wars. That caused a lot of problems in her functioning as an adult, and that proceeded into causing a lot of turmoil in our family because of her experiences, and then they're on to us. But she was first in, when she left the children's home, my grandparents, Mr. van Hustela, placed her in the house with Matje and Patje Lefavre. And she stayed there, and that was in the town of Laren, which is also in close to Bussum, probably about a 45-minute bike ride. And she was very happy there. It was an older couple. They had taken my mom and given her the identity of their grandchild. So she was very comfortable. She there's actually some pictures of her in the College of Charleston archive of Mom with these people outside of their little chateau in Loudon, and all seemed well for, you know, I think it was about 2 years, perhaps, maybe 1 year. And then it got very dangerous in that situation, and Meneer van Gastelen then put her in with a woman by the name of Doortje van Kloppenburg, which my mom remembers her being a nun, but from what I understand, she might have just been a very religious woman, and she kept Mom in a closet where she was to remain just by herself with her doll, Anna Kapop. Anna Kapop is the only thing that my mom had from the beginning of the war through the war. And then she even had the doll for a while after the war. But like I was telling you, how my grandparents didn't really want her to talk about the war. They thought that it would be wise to get rid of that doll. And unfortunately, that was the end of the doll. One day my mom came home and my grandmother had thrown the doll away, which caused a lot of stress for my mom then, now, and just talking about it breaks my heart. So when Meneer van Gastelen placed her with Doortje van Kloppenburg, that's when things got very, very brutal for my mom. She went from a loving home with the older couple to a fear-filled, scary time in the closet with rats, and she had no food and struggled, and the dark scared her so much, and being in closed spaces bothers her to this day. We were fortunate enough that she did survive all of these terrible, horrible things, and it really had to do with the smarts of my grandparents for releasing her. The hardest thing they ever had to do was to place her in other people's care when they knew that they could protect her best, but not during this time. So they did what was probably their worst fear, to let her go, and she survived barely through the horrors of the Kloppenburg brother terrorizing my mom in abusive ways, in all ways, shapes, and forms. And fortunately, after the war, it was just happenstance that my cousin, who was married to my Oma's brother, my grandmother's brother, happened upon my mom in this in the care of Doortje van Kloppenburg. And my mom did not remember anybody in the family. My mom was Dineke van Kloppenburg now. She was a Catholic girl. She did not want to leave where where she thought she was supposed to be. So it was very difficult for my grandparents after the war, since they also survived being in the different hiding places. It was very difficult for all of them to readjust as a family, which meant my mom left home at 17 and a half. She worked for Holland America Line. She traveled the world. She was a nanny in California and Canada, and went back to Europe and was in Germany, where she met my dad. Happened to be in Germany. He was stationed in Germany. He was an American soldier. And they married in Germany in 1963 and moved to Kingstree, South Carolina. And then they moved to Charleston in 1965. So many things to tell in such a short period of time. And I do hope that people can research the people that we're talking about and listen to their stories. They have given their stories, and you can actually hear their own words and hear them tell their tale of struggle. And now we're here to share our tale of how our family struggled, but then we survived.
Thank
and I'm
you.
sorry that I didn't ramble on. I apologize.
Thank you, Phyllis. Your mother was one of the ones I interviewed for the Shoah Foundation.
Yes, ma'am.
Her whole life. Thank you. Next, Marie. Marie, are you there?
He's muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Murray Treiser, and I live in the Charleston area, but I was born and grew up in Montreal, Canada. My parents were Armin and Mila Treiser, and my father was from an area called Satmar, which at the time of the war was Hungary, but is now Romania. And my mother was from an area called Bukovina, which is Romania. And my father came from a fairly middle-class family. He was from a family of Talmudic scholars, although he was a businessman as well. My mother's side of the family, they were more upper class. They had a very thriving business in Bukovina and did quite well. In any case, they were married on September the 1st, 1939, which, as you know, is the day World War II started. And right after they were married, they went to my father's village to live. And in 1942, there came a time when my father knew that the Germans were soon to come to their village. And he took the thing that was most valuable to him, and he went into the forest and he put it in a box and he buried it in the forest. Now, you would have thought he would have buried candlesticks or some silver or gold, something like that. But that's not what he buried. He buried his talit, or his prayer shawl, that belonged to his father and his father and his father. I now am in possession of talit, fourth generation, able to have this amazing memento that survived the Holocaust. In any case, the Germans did come. In 1942, my parents were deported to a camp by the name of Transnistria, which was on the border of Romania and Moldova. And this was not a concentration camp, it was a work camp. So there weren't any gas chambers, but I did, in my research, find out that the Transnistria work camp had one of the highest death rates of any camp. Not highest number, but highest percentage of people. In fact, 95% of the people who entered that camp died there. They died of typhus, they died of starvation, they died of overwork, and finally they were randomly shot by the Romanian police and by the soldiers. So my parents are now deported to Transnistria, and the road to Transnistria is very brutal. Long marches on foot, without food or water, where the elderly or the sick are simply shot or left on the road to be eaten by animals, followed by a cattle car drive of days duration where there were no supplies, crammed so that only standing was possible, no facilities in the cars so that the cars became covered in manure and the stench was awful and people were sliding around, and just unbearable conditions. When they got to the camp, the conditions were no better. They were imprisoned in pig stalls with no food or water, and typhus was rampant. The camp was on the Dniester River, and every day prisoners were chosen at random, taken to the river and shot. The river every day was full of dead bodies that were torn up. Frequently, mass graves were dug by the prisoners, and bodies were deposited there only to be eaten by animals once the weather warmed. So Jews had to make extraordinary, unbelievable efforts to stay alive. And this has all been documented by my cousin Felicia Carmelli, who herself was imprisoned as a child in the camp with my parents. So the question is, how did they survive in this camp? Well, they were amazingly organized. The men in the camp organized themselves into pairs to stand guard so that some of the other men could find a way to escape and see if they could find some food. My father was one of those who was chosen to sneak out at great risk, because obviously if he would have been caught just once, he would have been shot on the spot. And in any case, he was able to escape from this work camp to find whatever bits of food that he could. The question is, once he escaped the camp, how did he possibly survive outside the camp? He was a prisoner in prisoner garb. Well, he connected with the Romanian Jewish partisans who gave him a coat and some clothes and a discarded baby carriage. And he hid food in the carriage as though it was a baby. And only later did we actually discover that he rigged the buggy so that it had a false bottom where food that he stole from the soldiers' depot was hidden in this false bottom. And he would then sneak the food back into the camp. And there were several families who survived because of the food that my father was able to sneak into the camp. In the spring of 1944, the retreating German soldiers were approaching the camp and they were killing everyone in sight. My father knew that he could not simply stay there and wait for the Allies to come. So what he did was, with some of the other men in the camp, they started to dig a hole with their hands, and they carried away the dirt from the hole that they had dug in their pants to the river and to places where they could not, where the German soldiers were not. And they actually dug a sizable hole, enough for my whole family to be placed in this hole, and they covered it with dirt. And they made just a small area at the edge, which was open to the outside so that some oxygen could get in. When they were finally liberated, when they came out of this hole in the ground, they saw that everyone who had not hidden was killed by the retreating Germans. According to my father, the actual killing was not done by the Germans. It was done by Romanian and Ukrainian police who did the dirty work, so to speak. My father always said that with the Germans, maybe you went to a camp and maybe you survived or maybe you didn't. But with the Romanians and the Ukrainians, they shot you on the spot. There was no way to survive with them. So because of that, when my father finally came out of this hole in the ground and he knew liberation was at hand, he was actually quite scared, because if the Romanians got to the camp first, they would kill the witnesses to their crimes. But ultimately, liberation happened by the Romanian partisan Jews, who were not so motivated to save Jews per se, but they were willing to do so if it suited their purposes. And what was their purpose? To provide witnesses to the crimes that had been committed in the camp. So if you ask me, how did my parents survive? My answer is they survived because of ingenuity, courage, desire, and a never die attitude. They ultimately left Romania, and they had a friend by the name of Mr. Frankel who had family in Canada, and he got a visa to go to Canada by his family in Canada. However, unfortunately, Mr. Frankel died a week before he was supposed to go to Canada, and Mrs. Frankel did not want to go herself, so she offered the visa to my parents, and that is how my parents ultimately made it to Canada. So they actually came in on a false visa. I myself was born under the name Frankel because my parents were scared to change their name back until they became citizens. And they went on to lead a very upper class life in Montreal, Canada, quite successful and quite happy. I just want to add one other thing. I had an older sister, my eldest sister, died in that camp in Transnistria. And after the war, my parents took what was left of her body and they took her back to my mother's village and they buried her. And I actually went on a pilgrimage to this village. It's on the Ukrainian border. It's called Vatradorna, and I was able to find my sister's gravestone and her grave, which was incredible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Murray. Reggie?
My name is Reggie Guigui, and both of my parents are Holocaust survivors. My mother is from Czechoslovakia. She came from a family of 6, and 3 of her brothers were Zionists and left Czechoslovakia in 1936 and went to Palestine or Israel. Because of that, I have a very large family in Israel. Now, when the Germans came into Czechoslovakia, they said, you have to be a citizen of Czechoslovakia. And my grandparents were not. They were actually from the town of Auschwitz, and they had to go back to that town. Now, my mother, at the age of 16, had to volunteer to go to a concentration camp. At the time they came in and they said, we need 1 member of each family to volunteer to come to a concentration camp. And my mother had to volunteer. She was there for 3.5 years. There's a picture on the right of my mother. She is on the right, the third person, and standing next to her, the blonde woman, is her sister, Rosa. They both, my aunt also survived the war. She was in this camp for 3.5 years. And she said if she would have been in any other camp except the labor camp, even though the conditions were so terrible, they still had food rations, they could still survive. And later on, when they came up with the final solution, she was sent to another camp. And my mother was a very, very strong-willed woman, and I believe that strong will is what kept her alive. She spoke fluent German. She looked like an Aryan, and she spoke up to a German soldier one time, helping somebody and explaining. Because of that, she got whipped with the cat of nine tails. She got 5 lashes, but she refused to cry because she wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her crying. I believe that strong will is what kept her alive. She was liberated in May 8th, 1945, and she was liberated from the area of Gross Rosen. They had quite a few of camps there. And she made her way to Poland, where she met my father. Now, like I said, I have a very large family in Israel because her 3 brothers left, and she had 1 brother who died and was executed 2 days before liberation. Now, my father comes from Poland, and on the left, you can see my father's family in Poland. He came from a very affluent, assimilated family. They owned a feather factory that was very prosperous, and my aunt was called the Feather Queen of Poland. And they could not believe that this was going to happen to them. They could not believe that the Germans were going to come into their town and do anything. And when they did, it was a rude awakening for them. My father came from a family of 10 siblings. Miraculously, 7 of them survived, which is almost unheard of. I'm one of the few children who actually has family because of that. Now, my father was married before the war, and in 1941, he had a daughter. And the Germans had given my father, he'd gotten a work permit to work in a factory. My father came home in August of 1943, and his wife and daughter were gone. Somebody who had survived that transport told him what happened. They had gone into the basement and they'd hidden with 60 other people when my sister started to cry, and they found them and took them all to Auschwitz. Now, my father later on was sent to concentration camp with his 2 brothers. And I really believe being with his 2 brothers and having family made him survive. They worked together as a group to help each other. They even had a little business, I have no idea how they did this, of selling or trading, I should say, cigarettes for food. I have no idea how that worked, but they did. When they were liberated, they were also liberated from the same area of Gross Rosen, and they were liberated by the Russians. My uncle, he was cold and he saw a dead German soldier, and he took his jacket and put it on. When the Russians came to liberate them, they saw him wearing a German jacket, and they were ready to shoot him. Then this other soldier, and I think he was an official, he might have been a KGB. He said, no, look at him, he's skin and bones, he's a survivor. And this Russian soldier befriended my father and my brother. And when they came to this town in Poland, they actually gave them the house to live in of the German commandant had run away. And he warned them when the communists were going to close the borders, and they told them they had to get out at a certain date, otherwise it would be closed. My parents set up an escape route where 500 people followed afterwards, and they made it to the American occupied part of Germany. They were there for 4 years, and they waited to get immigration papers to go to the United States. My mother had a very bad heart condition. We were one of the few people who flew. It was November 1949, and with the help of HIAS, which is a Hebrew Immigrant Aid Association, we came to the United States. We spent about 2 weeks, and there's a picture of my parents and my brother and myself. We spent about 2 weeks in New York, and my parents absolutely hated it there. And they said, send us anywhere, and they sent us to Cincinnati, Ohio. In Cincinnati, it took 8 years, but his two brothers also, my father's two brothers also joined them in Cincinnati. And they started again their feather company. And the bankers could never understand how three brothers who couldn't speak English built up a successful business. Until this day, it is 6 generations. And they went from ashes to light, and they built a beautiful life for themselves and my brother and myself.
Thank you, Reggie. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your stories. We're going to move on to the next question. I think the sharing of your stories is the most important part of this whole evening. So for the next question, if you could try to keep it to 2 minutes, your response. The question is, did your parents talk to you about the Holocaust? And if they did, what did they tell you? And at what age were you? And if not, were you aware of it? We'll start with Fred this time.
So my parents settled in the Chicago area. They were married in 1948. They eventually moved to a neighborhood called Rogers Park in Chicago, which bordered 2 towns, Lincoln and Skokie. In those areas is where lots of survivors had settled. And in fact, my parents had joined a B'nai B'rith lodge called Janusz Korczak Lodge. And for those who don't know, Janusz Korczak was a Polish pediatrician who was well known to be able to tried to save many children during the war. So my parents didn't talk about it at all. In fact, my mom was almost militant in the feeling of we should not hear or talk about it at all. My father, you could tell sometimes wanted to talk about it, but he was just shut down a lot by her. And so because most of their friends and people they associated with were Holocaust survivors, I occasionally heard some things here and there, but not much. It was really pretty much shut out. So the age that I really heard a lot about the Holocaust from my parents was when I turned 52 years old. I'm 65 now. And so at that time, my mom had passed away. And it was at that time that my dad had decided to talk about the Holocaust. And the way I stumbled on this was that I'd seen a letter on his desk when we were saying Shiva for my mom. And it was one of his cousins who was in Israel that talked about some of his experiences. And I said, why don't I know about this? And he didn't say it, but I knew it was because my mom didn't want to do that. So he started writing me letters. I was living in a different town, and he wrote these long letters, 25-page letters back and forth. It just talked about everything, just came out like a waterfall. And so, from that, during that time, I really learned a lot about what happened. I learned about how he served during the war. I didn't, and what he did with the American soldiers and helped some of the efforts of getting people from Europe into Israel. And it's just a lot that was going on. And I really didn't, it was just, sort of just all came out and it was very emotional for me. And then I would talk to some of their friends. And I really, then of course made me very curious. So I read as much as I could about the Holocaust and tried to talk to some people. But it was really later in life at age 52 that I really knew more about the Holocaust than anything during my years growing up. And my brother, who had passed away, he was 5 years older than me, also didn't know anything either. And he didn't survive to hear some of the stories that my dad had talked about. So that's all of it on that subject.
Thank you, Fred. Evaline?
So my mom, Deanie Atkins, Phyllis is my sister. Just wanted to give everybody, I let Phyllis tell the story. I don't remember a time where I didn't know about the Holocaust. My earliest memories were of my mom telling us inappropriate stories of the Holocaust. My childhood was different, I suppose, than most, or our childhood was. I didn't fear the boogeyman. I feared Nazis coming into my house and tying up my brother and sister and my parents, and me having to watch them beat my family to death. I would have terror dreams of that. So it shaped my life. It shaped my childhood. It shaped it so much that when I had children of my own, I had a really hard time trying to figure out when we could tell the kids and teach the kids about the Holocaust. It's important that we know about it. They are generational survivors, but I didn't know when was it appropriate, because at 3, knowing that mom was beat by a German soldier is not appropriate. So that is definitely a different perspective.
Phyllis, do you want to add to that?
Well, just basically that mom wasn't allowed to really talk about the Holocaust when she was growing up. So I think that's why she spoke of it so freely. And it was pretty shocking. But like Evaline said, I don't recall not knowing about the Holocaust and not knowing about the horrific deeds that happened during that period of time. We didn't speak about it much with our grandparents, but they fortunately, in their older age, they opened up a lot, which was really great, because, you know, excuse me, my mom remembers a lot as a child, and you remember things as a child and your perspective is a little different. And then when you get older, you know, you can look back on those things, you still have that memory as a child. So it was good for us to finally be able to ask my grandfather, but mostly my grandmother. After my grandfather died in 2001, my Oma fortunately lived another, you know, decade or so, and really opened up to us, and she told us things that I'm so grateful for, and I will share with everyone one day, but about her true, like she would never say a word about hatred or anything like that. But I did hear her say how she hated that Dortje von Kloppenburg, how she caused my grandmother much strife and pain. And that was just surprising to me, even as a grown adult, to hear my grandmother say something like that. But we were very much used to my mom. She went to, you know, our elementary school dressed in full Dutch costume, talked about Dutch culture, and then talked about her Holocaust, or her Holocaust story, which was unheard of in the 70s. And I was a little scared and embarrassed when I was younger, but growing up and then realizing this is why we do this. This is the reason, to share these things with all of you so that you can learn from these things and then share their stories. Their voices will soon not be heard anymore. And it is up to us and you to please share these tales that you're hearing tonight.
Very true. Thank you. Murray?
Okay, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Okay,
Yeah.
so my parents never, ever, ever spoke one single word about the Holocaust. I remember when I was a child, my father's had nightmares every single night. And I really couldn't understand what that was all about. But my parents never explained that to me. But then I went off to school, and I went to what you might consider to be a modern yeshiva type of situation. And we learned a lot about the Holocaust there. So I slowly began to put 2 and 2 together and recognize that my father's nightmares had to be related to that somehow. Everything I know about my parents' time during the Holocaust is from the research done by my cousin Felicia Carmelli, who was a child in the camp with my parents and survived with them. Her life's ambition, she ultimately made it to Canada and became a psychologist in Toronto. And her life's ambition was dedicated to documenting the story of the atrocities at Transnistria. And she wrote 2 books, one of which won the Holocaust Memorial Museum Prize in 1994. And once I read those books, a whole world of information opened up to me that I absolutely had no idea about. It was stunning, absolutely stunning to me. So just unbelievable how my parents were able to just, it seems to me, put it on a shelf and move forward and make a new life for themselves, and not let the past keep them from moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Reggie?
My parents never talked about it. They try to make our life as normal and as American as possible. But I remember one incident when I was about 3.5, 4 years old, and we lived in a house where it's divided into 3 families. And the woman who owned the house was an elderly grandmother. And I remember standing with my mother on the lawn and seeing the car pull up and seeing these kids come out and yelling, "Grandma, Grandma." And I looked at my mother and I said, "Grandma? What's a grandma? Where is my grandma?" And my mother, I just remember it so vividly. She quieted me. She said, "Your grandmother is not here. She died." And that was it. I mean, the answer she gave me was so harsh. I was so surprised. And this woman, I remember her name, Mrs. Greenberg, she says, "You know what, Regina, you can call me Grandma." And this woman was at my wedding. Now, I never talked about the Holocaust. My parents never mentioned it, like I said, but they had a close group of friends and they would come to our house all the time and play cards, and they would be playing cards and they would be talking, and all of a sudden something came up about the Holocaust and my ears would pick up and I would listen. And they would say, "Did this happen to you? This happened to me." That's where I got bits and pieces. I really didn't ask questions until the first Holocaust movie came out because I knew how painful it was for them to talk about. When the first Holocaust movie came out, like Murray, my father was up at night screaming. He was hiding his children. Then he was hiding his grandchildren in garbage cans, trying to save them. So the scars of what they went through was so difficult that I never asked questions until about 1989, when I discovered these pictures from my mother and started asking questions and started lecturing on the Holocaust. I started to get more stories from her. I did not get a lot from my father. He ended up telling my son when he was 16 years old, all these stories that I still don't know about. I found out about that 2 years ago. So it was very hard for them to talk to us about it, but it was part of my life always. It was always there, and it still is. And I've passed it on to my children. Thank you.
Thank you. Sandra?
I asked my sister about this when I got the questions as to whether she could remember my parents talking about the Holocaust, and neither of us could remember our parents talking about it, and yet we always seemed to know about it. We did learn about it in Sunday school, so I think that was maybe responsible for what we knew about the Holocaust. I do remember bringing a book on the Holocaust home from Sunday school once, and I was sitting watching television with my mother, and I read her a passage from this book, which was horrible. And she just looked straight ahead. She just didn't acknowledge that I was reading this. And then I realized what a terrible mistake I'd made by bringing up this bad memory, and I never wanted to bring it up anymore. When we were older already and people started talking more about World War II and their experiences, then, as everyone else has said, they started to be more vocal and give us more memories. But I think we knew that they were they were in the Holocaust, but we really never discussed it as far as I can remember. But you know, what you learn later and what you learned as a child, it kind of gets mixed up.
Okay. So I'm telling you that we only have a few minutes left and we have 3 questions. So I'm going to let you answer whichever question you want in only 2 minutes. So you can either talk about what ways did growing up with survivor parents shape your childhood and who you are today? Or did your parents have a tendency to want to be around other Holocaust survivors? Or, and some of you have already talked about this, why is it important to learn about the Holocaust? Okay, Murray.
Thanks so much. So being a child of survivor was instrumental, I think, in getting me to where I am, because it instilled in me a burning ambition to succeed. I realized that the dreams of my parents, the dreams that they never had an opportunity to fulfill, they were living their life through me in some way. And I had to make sure that their sacrifice to give me, all the opportunities that I had. I had to make good on them. I think I had to make sure that I didn't waste them and that I reached my potential. So I was really, I feel like I had a burning desire to make them proud of me. So they really shaped my life, unbelievably so. So the question is, why is it important to learn about the Holocaust? And I think that, there are millions of stories out there that will be lost very soon. But by preserving the stories of the survivors and making them available to a wide audience, we actually sustain the memory of all those who perished at the hands of hatred. We learn the lesson of what happens when apathy and indifference rules. The stories of those who survived against all odds demonstrate courage, strength, and wit. But they're also a tribute to people, strangers in many cases, who through acts of kindness and decency in their darkest moments and at great risk to themselves helped preserve some faith in humanity. Therefore, I submit to you that it is important to learn about the Holocaust to serve as an inspiration that man can rise above evil. Thank you.
Thank you. Evaline?
I think the questions all kind of mesh together for me because my mother was a child survivor. It affected me personally on such a deep level that my life really was about the Holocaust. I learned from a very young age that if it wasn't for the kindness of others, the righteous Gentile, I wouldn't be sitting here now. My grandparents wouldn't have been there. I think it was instilled in me in a very young age that we have the obligation to continue on as Jews, as strong Jews. For those who did not survive, a lot of our family did not survive, that I have an obligation to procreate because just by having my children, Hitler lost. But you can look around at today, you can look just open up the newspaper, whether we didn't learn from our past, whether we just forgot about it. We need to speak up as second generation survivors. I don't read Holocaust books. I don't like seeing the movies. Don't particularly even enjoy doing this, to be quite honest. But if I don't, no one is ever going to learn. We're just going to forget. It's going to get swept under the carpet. It breaks my heart that my mother has to watch the hate now, similar to the hate that she had growing up. So it is an important part of my life and my being. It was instilled in me from a young age that we need to speak up for those who can't speak, and we need to learn from our mistakes. So I need to help those who cannot help themselves. As a Jew, as a second generation survivor, as a daughter of a survivor, that we have to speak up, speak my truth, and speak my mother's truth and my grandparents' truth.
Thank you. Phillis?
Amen to that, of course. And I appreciate my sister being vocal today, as she is often about the Holocaust, even though she does not love talking about it. I, on the other hand, don't mind talking about it because I know that it's for the greater good. It's just something that was just instilled in my brain in the 80s. Mom, the question about if mom wanted to be around other Holocaust survivors, and the answer is we didn't know that there were other Holocaust survivors in Charleston. I wish we did, but we didn't. Nobody talked about it in the 70s. We had to go to Holland, where my mom had intensive inpatient psychiatric treatment at a hospital called Centrum 45 that was specific for Holocaust survivors and resistance fighters. So, I mean, it was just something else, but, you know, it shapes me, and it also, it makes me go to these memorial sites. I go to the Auschwitz memorial site. You know, when will a picture of my great uncles pop up? When, you know, maybe I'll see there a picture of them, which we have hardly any of them. My grandmother's 17-year-old brother, you know, killed for nothing. And for this reason, I search for them. I find their names. I find the dates that they were killed. I try to remember these things, and I try to share these things, and I hope everyone does as well. And I thank everybody for listening tonight.
Thank you. Sandra?
So it's kind of hard to know when, your parents obviously influenced you a lot, and I don't exactly know what part influenced me because they were Holocaust survivors or just what their personalities were. But one area that they really did influence my thoughts was on the importance of Holocaust education. So I thought a lot about this, and I would like to sort of channel what I think they would have felt about today's world and what Holocaust education means for that. So Mom and Dad of blessed memory, if you're listening, this one's for you. My parents are actually both very skeptical about the amount of money that has been poured into Holocaust museums and research. They thought that the attention to the Holocaust had become a self-perpetuating industry. What was the point of all the study if it did not produce any results? The platitude "never again" annoyed my parents because of its vagueness and because history suggests that genocides will continue and are largely out of our control. As an adult, as all of you know, I've been actively involved in Holocaust education, but my efforts have increasingly been geared towards reflecting an action-oriented mindset. Holocaust education programs in the schools are important because they're catalysts for anti-bullying and anti-racism initiatives. So therefore, I'm going to join the Southeastern Board of the ADL. If I believe that the Holocaust is an example of a government that was subverted by a dictator, namely by Hitler, then I should actively support contemporary political decisions that impede that progression. Through political and educational activism, I can try to act against the forces that undermine a pluralistic society by demonizing the other. Here's one example that's come up in the news lately. We know German history between the world wars is a cautionary tale of society's breakdown. The conservatives who led Germany into World War I refused to accept their loss. Military officers and right-wingers created the stab in the back myth, claiming that Imperial Germany never actually lost World War I. They said that the defeat was actually a conspiracy. If it had not been for political sabotage by social democrats and Jews back home, the army would never have had to give in. That the claim was false didn't matter. It stirred humiliation and anger, and when combined with a weak economy, it was exploited by Adolf Hitler. Now this really hit home for me because my dad in his memoir describes Hitler talking on the radio in 1938. Dad writes that Hitler screamed on the radio, "The Jews stabbed Germany in the back, and that's why Germany lost the war. Jews are capitalists and communists, and they're planning an international conspiracy. Stop the Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil." As been pointed out by many lately, the current Stop the Steal campaign in this country recalls the stab in the back myth. To be clear, I'm not equating our president with Hitler or the United States with Germany in 1938, and I'm not trying to convince any of you who have a different point of view. But I do think that it's naive to ask why it's important to learn about the Holocaust without really paying attention to politics and breakdowns in the rule of law. As a child of survivors, I'm acutely conscious that based on my family's experience, I have to actively dispute what I consider to be dangerous paths that our leaders are taking. It's my duty to speak out against those in power if I believe that they are misguided. It's my duty to urge our elected representatives to pass a hate crime bill in South Carolina. And I hope that you all saw the article on that in the Post and Courier today. And thanks to a lot of the people on the call that are involved in that. So why do I think it's important as a child of survivors to have Holocaust education? Because we have to fight the exclusion of the other with both political and educational action. Thanks.
Thank you. Fred? Unmute, Fred.
Sorry, as Sandra pointed out, it's hard to sort out what influences you had growing up, and even though they didn't talk about much, being a son of immigrants, so there's all that, you have to become a doctor, lawyer, or a CPA to be able to achieve. So some of that was probably just common to many immigrants. But I knew my mom was a very intense and often difficult person. My dad, on the other hand, was very non-judgmental, very kind person. And, I don't know all the dynamics between them and how that may have affected me. I do know that many of my friends who also grew up with parents that survived the Holocaust have blamed their parents for some of their neurosis and some other things. I never felt that growing up. It's either the way I'm wired or the way that I was brought up. So it's very hard to say that. In fact, I didn't really see the influence of the Holocaust on my parents directly, other than one incident with my father, where if you remember the song in the late 60s, American Pie came out, and it was played a lot. And there's one chorus in the lyrics that says, "This will be the day that I die." And my father just bristled at that song. He said, "Why do they have to talk about dying in a song? It's supposed to be fun and enjoyable. Why are they talking about dying?" It never dawned on me why that was hitting him so hard. So years later, again, it's hard to sort out those things. And I did grow up in a neighborhood where there was lots of Holocaust survivors. And I do know that they talked amongst themselves a little bit, but if the kids came into the room or in just general, we didn't hear anything. So it's just hard to sort out what influenced you and what didn't. And I was, well into my adulthood as age 52, so I really learned a lot about what went on, and that made me hungry to learn more and talk to my father a lot about it. And then living in Charleston, and Sandra said it very well, but living in Charleston, you just have that sense of history of what happened, that when there are Holocaust, this isn't the first Holocaust that happened during World War II. They happened before and they happened afterwards. And if you think about the slave trade that happened here in Charleston, that's just another slow-moving Holocaust that had gone on for really centuries. And so that hits home over here too. So being able to talk about that, to have a Holocaust memorial, to have these, us going to schools and talking to the kids to talk about what is, currently going on and how that relates to history is extremely important. So, I think Sandra said it very well as far as what the meaning of, why we have to talk about this. And I appreciate that we're able to do that today.
Thank you. Reggie.
Well, I agree with what everybody said, and I think the same thing. But I think growing up as a child of survivors has really shaped who I am today and who my children are today. I've always looked at the world in a different light. Every stage of life would always bring new emotions and thoughts. Even in the most joyous, happy occasions was overcast by the dark shadows of the Holocaust, needing to have big celebrations of baby namings, bar mitzvahs, and weddings, because there was a time that our family couldn't do that. Or to celebrate, to show the world that we're here, we are still here. And even my close friend, who is non-Jewish, I had to ask her, would you take in my children if anything ever happened in the world again, if things would change? Even looking at my firstborn grandchild, my thoughts automatically turned, how is it possible for anyone, for any human, to murder innocent children? And 1.5 million children were massacred, murdered. The Holocaust is always lurking behind every thought that I have. I am the daughter of the Shoah, and my looking glasses of the world are grayed by what my family experienced. I've been fighting prejudice, injustice, anti-Semitism all my life. In the past 30 years, I have been lecturing and fighting any kind of discrimination that I see and trying to bring Holocaust education into the schools. One time I lectured for 6 hours straight. And at night, I was like my father. I went home and I had a nightmare that I was hiding my kids in garbage cans and trying to save them. So the Holocaust has impacted my life in a big way, and has impacted my children's life in a big way, and how they look at the world. And now the world is a scary place, unfortunately. And I hope through education that we can turn it around. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all of you for sharing your family stories and your personal feelings and stories about the Holocaust. And now I'm going to turn the program over to Samantha Krantz.
Now I'd like to introduce Eileen Turbo, our co-chair of the member program, to conclude our program.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Eileen. And I especially want to thank all of the participants for a truly emotional and personal insight into what hate can do through generations. It has been 75 years since the end of World War II. And as you heard tonight, these stories carried from survivors to their children still teach us lessons today and still remind us, as Sandra and Reggie reminded us, of what hate left rampant can do. So it is a very important, I guess, pillar of the Federation to use the Remember program to educate and remind people about those facts. So you have something on your screen that tells you that if you would like to have a child of survivor to come see you and talk personally with your group, your organization, your school, you can contact the Remember program at jewishcharleston.org. I would like to encourage you to go to that same website and go to stampouthate.sc to learn more about what we're doing in South Carolina to stamp out hate and create hate crime legislation. And I'd like to invite all of you who are participating, and I thank you for taking the time to do so, to come to our annual meeting, our virtual annual meeting of the Charleston Jewish Federation next Wednesday, the 9th of December at 7 p.m. You can register at jewishcharleston.org, because you will learn not only what the Remember program is doing, but what the Federation does here in Charleston, in Israel, and throughout the world to benefit the Jewish community. Again, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you in a better 2021 for future programs. Good night.